Oh, you stand in the quiet village of Godric's Hollow on a summer evening in 1899, and the air smells of honeysuckle and possibility, though you don't yet know that this particular summer will end in blood and betrayal, because right now everything still feels like the beginning of a grand adventure. The cottage windows glow with warm lamplight, and you can hear the distant laughter of children playing their last games before bedtime, unaware that in one of these very homes, two young men are meeting for the first time, and their friendship will eventually reshape the entire wizarding world in ways both terrible and profound. Gellert Grindelwald has just arrived in England, expelled from Durmstrang Institute for his twisted experiments and dangerous obsessions, though if you asked his great-aunt Bathilda Bagshot, she'd probably tell you he's just a misunderstood boy with an overly active imagination and perhaps a slight tendency toward megalomania. But what elderly aunt doesn't make excuses for her favorite nephew? You watch as this golden-haired young wizard, barely 17, walks through the village with the confidence of someone who believes he's destined for greatness. And honestly, he's not entirely wrong about the greatness part, though he's dramatically miscalculated the definition of what makes someone truly great. The historical record shows that Grindelwald was born in 1883, making him just 2 years older than Albus Dumbledore, and scholars still debate whether his expulsion from Durmstrang was the catalyst for his dark turn or merely a symptom of ideas already festering in his brilliant mind. You notice how he carries himself with an aristocratic bearing that would make a peacock feel underdressed, and there's something unsettling about the way his mismatched eyes seem to pierce through the ordinary world to see possibilities that others miss. Possibilities that involve subjugating non-magical people for the greater good. Though you have to wonder if he ever considered that maybe, just maybe, enslaving entire populations might not actually qualify as good in any meaningful sense. In this same village lives Albus Dumbledore, recently graduated from Hogwarts, with honors so numerous they could paper a small bathroom, now trapped at home caring for his younger siblings after his mother's tragic death and his father's imprisonment for attacking Muggle boys who had harmed his daughter. You can see the frustration radiating from the Dumbledore cottage like heat from a cauldron, because here's possibly the most brilliant wizard of his generation, stuck changing his brother's socks and managing his traumatized sister Ariana, when he should be off discovering new magical theories or at least having a social life that doesn't revolve around meal schedules and temper tantrums. The quirky historical detail that often gets overlooked is that Dumbledore's father, Percival, never revealed his true motive for the attack, allowing people to believe he was simply a Muggle hater, which meant young Albus grew up under the shadow of his father's apparent prejudice, while secretly knowing the truth was far more complicated and heartbreaking. When these two young men finally meet, you can practically see the intellectual fireworks exploding between them, because both have been starving for someone who can match their mental gymnastics. And suddenly, here they are, two sides of an extraordinary coin, finishing each other's theoretical sentences and sketching out plans for magical revolution on spare parchment like teenagers planning a road trip, except their road trip involves fundamentally restructuring wizard-muggle relations and possibly conquering death itself, so slightly more ambitious than your average summer vacation. Grindelwald speaks passionately about his vision of a world where wizards rule openly, no longer hiding their powers, and he makes it sound almost reasonable when he argues that magical people have a responsibility to guide non-magical people, sort of like a very authoritarian shepherd with very unwilling sheep who never asked for guidance in the first place. You watch Dumbledore's eyes light up with a mixture of intellectual excitement and something else, something deeper and more personal. Because here finally is someone who sees him, truly sees him, not as a tragedy-struck boy playing parent, but as the remarkable mind he knows himself to be. Historians note that this summer of 1899 was also the year the Second Boer War began in South Africa, And while the Muggle world was grappling with imperialism and its discontents, these two wizards were essentially plotting a magical version of the same thing, proving that bad ideas about ruling other people are disappointingly universal across both magical and non-magical societies. The two young men spend their days in fevered discussion, developing what they call their plans for the greater good, and they even begin searching for the Deathly Hallows, three legendary magical objects that, if united, would supposedly make their possessor the Master of Death, because apparently enslaving Muggles wasn't quite ambitious enough and they needed to add immortality to their summer bucket list. You notice how Dumbledore's younger brother Aberforth watches these new developments with increasing suspicion because, unlike his brilliant brother, Aberforth has a fairly good nose for detecting when someone is full of dangerous nonsense. And Grindelwald smells like an entire factory of dangerous nonsense, with a side of charismatic manipulation. The Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Cloak of Invisibility become objects of obsession, and you realize that this quest isn't really about the objects themselves, but about what they represent. Power over death, power over others, power over the fundamental rules that govern existence, and maybe just a tiny bit of teenage hubris amplified to apocalyptic proportions. An unusual detail that scholars find fascinating is that Grindelwald had already begun formulating his symbol, a triangular eye that combined representations of all three Hallows, and he would later use this symbol as his signature mark, proving that even aspiring Dark Lords understand the importance of branding and visual identity in building a successful evil empire. Aberforth, growing increasingly concerned about his brother's neglect of Ariana and his obsession with this disturbing new friend, finally confronts them both, and you can feel the tension crackling like static electricity before a storm, because this confrontation has been building all summer like pressure in a sealed cauldron, and everyone in the room knows that something is about to explode. The argument escalates quickly, with Aberforth quite reasonably pointing out that gallivanting around looking for magical artifacts while their unstable sister sits alone at home might not qualify as responsible guardianship. And Grindelwald, displaying the empathy of a particularly self-centered rock, essentially tells Aberforth to mind his own business in language that is probably less polite than that summary suggests. Wands are drawn, and suddenly these aren't just words anymore, but actual magical violence crackling through the small cottage. And you want to shout at them to stop, to think about what they're doing, but of course they can't hear you because you're just an observer in this tragic scene that played out over a century ago. Three young men fire spells in a confined space, and in the chaos and fury, someone's curse goes astray. And Ariana Dumbledore, the traumatized girl who has been at the center of so much of this family's pain, is struck down and killed. You watch as time seems to freeze, as three young men realize simultaneously that something irreversible has just occurred, and the brilliant summer of grand plans and greater good comes crashing down into the worst kind of reality. No one ever knows for certain whose spell killed Ariana. And this uncertainty will haunt Albus Dumbledore for the rest of his very long life, because the possibility that he might have killed his own sister while fighting for his dubious friendship with Grindelwald is almost too terrible to contemplate, yet contemplate it he will, every day for decades. Grindelwald flees England immediately, and you watch as the golden summer friendship dissolves like morning mist, leaving behind only grief and regret and a devastated family. Aberforth's fury toward his brother becomes a permanent fixture of their relationship, and he will break Albus's nose at their sister's funeral, which is frankly one of the more understandable uses of violence in this entire tragic tale. Dumbledore, crushed by guilt and loss, abandons his grand plans for wizard supremacy and instead takes a teaching position at Hogwarts, burying himself in education and research, trying to forget the terrible summer when he lost both his sister and his moral compass. Scholars endlessly debate whether Dumbledore's feelings for Grindelwald were romantic in nature, and author J.K. Rowling later confirmed that Dumbledore was gay and had been in love with Grindelwald, which adds another layer of tragedy to this story, because here was a young man experiencing his first love and intellectual partnership simultaneously, making it nearly impossible for him to see clearly the darkness in his friend's vision until it was too late. You stand in the now quiet cottage feeling the weight of everything that has just been destroyed, and you understand that this is where the real story begins, not in the bright hopes of summer, but in the ashes of autumn. Because Grindelwald will continue pursuing his vision of magical supremacy, and Dumbledore, haunted by his past, will eventually have to face his former friend to stop him. But that confrontation is still decades away, and there are many more tragedies to come before these two brilliant wizards meet again. You follow Grindelwald as he leaves England behind, and instead of slinking away in shame like a normal person who just caused a death, he apparently decides that this is the perfect time to really commit to his megalomaniac 5-year plan. Because nothing says processing grief and trauma like launching a campaign to subjugate an entire segment of the global population. He travels across Europe, gathering followers with his magnetic charisma and his compelling, if morally bankrupt, vision of wizard supremacy. And you have to admit that the man knows how to work a crowd, even if the message he's selling would make any ethicist break out in hives. The symbol he designed, that triangular eye representing the Deathly Hallows, begins appearing on walls and in secret meeting places, sort of like a very sinister game of magical graffiti, except instead of spray paint it's carved with wands, and instead of marking territory, it's marking the beginning of a movement that will eventually plunge the wizarding world into its darkest period. His speeches are masterpieces of rhetoric, painting a picture of a world where magical people no longer live in fear or hiding, where they can openly use their abilities and guide the non-magical world toward what he frames as enlightenment, though you notice he's conveniently vague about what happens to muggles, who aren't particularly interested in being guided by anyone, magical or otherwise. You watch as wizards and witches from across Europe begin to flock to his cause, some genuinely believing in his vision of magical supremacy, others simply drawn to his charisma and the promise of power, and a few who are probably just in it for the dramatic black robes and sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, because even evil movements understand that people need community and fashion. One quirky detail that often surprises people is that Grindelwald was actually a skilled seer, possessing genuine prophetic abilities, which meant his visions of the future weren't entirely fabricated nonsense, but contained genuine glimpses of possible outcomes, making him even more dangerous because he could legitimately claim to see disaster ahead if wizards didn't take control, conveniently ignoring that his own actions were creating the very disasters he claimed to be preventing. His base of operations becomes Nurmengard, a prison fortress he builds in the Austrian Alps. And yes, you read that correctly. This man builds himself a prison before he even really gets his reign of terror properly started, which either shows remarkable foresight or a concerning level of self-awareness about how this whole endeavor is likely to end, though probably neither, since he carves "for the greater good" over the entrance in a display of irony so thick you could cut it with a wand. By the 1920s, Grindelwald's influence has spread like a particularly persistent magical fungus, and he's no longer just talking about wizard supremacy, but actively working toward it, conducting raids, attacking those who oppose him, and generally behaving like someone who watched one too many villain origin stories and decided to speedrun all the warning signs. You travel to Paris in 1927, where the wizarding community is in turmoil, and you witness Grindelwald holding a rally that would make any propagandist weep with envy, because this man has mastered the art of manipulating hope, fear, and resentment into a toxic cocktail that his followers drink eagerly. He shows his supporters visions of the future, including the horrors of World War II that he has seen. And while he's not wrong about the terrible war coming, his solution of "let's put wizards in charge of everything" is a bit like seeing someone with a headache and suggesting emergency brain removal as the obvious cure. The historical context here is fascinating because Grindelwald's rise occurs during the interwar period, when the Muggle world was grappling with the aftermath of World War I and the rise of fascism, and scholars debate whether J.K. Rowling intentionally paralleled Grindelwald's movement with the rise of Hitler and Mussolini, or whether it's simply that authoritarian movements share certain characteristics, regardless of whether they're magical or mundane. You notice that his followers include a disturbing number of pure-blood supremacists, though Grindelwald himself seems less concerned with blood purity than with magical ability itself, which makes him slightly less bigoted than future dark wizards like Voldemort, though that's an incredibly low bar that basically exists underground in terms of moral achievement. His inner circle includes some truly unpleasant individuals, and you watch as he sends them out on missions that grow increasingly violent, attacking Muggles and wizard opponents alike, creating an atmosphere of terror that begins to grip the magical communities across Europe. The French Ministry of Magic tries to stop him, and you witness the chaos at the rally when Aurors attempt to capture him, but Grindelwald is far too powerful and too clever for straightforward confrontation, and he escapes in a display of magic that leaves observers both terrified and reluctantly impressed, sort of like watching someone juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle and simultaneously solving complex calculus problems, except the chainsaws are deadly curses, and the unicycle is made of pure arrogance. An unusual aspect of his methodology is that he seems to genuinely believe his own propaganda, which makes him more dangerous than a cynical manipulator because he has the conviction of true fanaticism. And you can see in his eyes that he really does think he's saving the world, one terrified Muggle at a time. You follow the trail of destruction he leaves across Europe, and it becomes clear that this is no longer just a philosophical disagreement about wizard-Muggle relations, but an actual war with casualties mounting and communities torn apart by conflicting loyalties. Some wizarding families are split down the middle, with children joining Grindelwald's cause while their parents desperately try to maintain neutrality or actively resist, and you realize that this is one of the cruelest aspects of any civil conflict, the way it turns dining room tables into battlefields and makes enemies of people who once shared bloodlines. The International Confederation of Wizards is in a state of paralysis, unable to agree on a coordinated response, with some members wanting immediate action while others counsel patience or even appeasement. And you want to shake them and point out that appeasing someone who's building a literal prison fortress with "for the greater good" carved over the entrance is probably not going to work out well for anyone involved. By the 1930s, as the Muggle world slides toward World War II, Grindelwald's power is at its peak, and he controls vast territories across Europe, ruling through a combination of genuine support from his followers and absolute terror for everyone else. You watch as he conducts experiments in magic that push boundaries most wizards wouldn't even approach, seeking ever more powerful ways to enforce his vision, and there's something particularly chilling about seeing someone with immense natural talent use that talent to cause harm rather than help, like watching a master chef who only ever makes poison. The debate among magical historians centers on whether Grindelwald could have been stopped earlier if the wizarding world had acted decisively, or whether his seer abilities gave him such an advantage that he could counter any conventional opposition. And there's no clear answer because we only know what actually happened, not what might have been. His treatment of prisoners at Nurmengard is reportedly terrible, though not as systematically cruel as Voldemort's followers would later become, which again is grading on a curve so generous it might as well be a circle, because not as bad as Voldemort is not actually a meaningful achievement in human decency. You notice that throughout all of this, one name is conspicuously absent from the resistance: Albus Dumbledore, who has spent these decades teaching at Hogwarts, becoming deputy headmaster, and earning a reputation as the most brilliant wizard of his age, yet consistently refusing to confront his former friend, and everyone in the wizarding world knows why he won't face Grindelwald, even if they don't speak it aloud, because some guilts are too heavy to carry into battle. The pressure on Dumbledore mounts with each passing year, with each new atrocity committed in the name of the greater good, and you can see the burden weighing on him like physical chains because he knows that he is possibly the only wizard powerful enough to stop Grindelwald. But facing him means facing everything that happened that terrible day in Godric's Hollow, means risking the confirmation of his worst fear that his spell was the one that killed Ariana. Grindelwald's followers begin spreading into Britain more actively, and suddenly this isn't just a continental problem, but a threat to Hogwarts itself, to the students Dumbledore has spent decades protecting and teaching, and you watch as the man's internal struggle plays out across his face like a tragic stage play where every act ends in moral complexity. The wizarding world's desperation grows palpable, like the air before a lightning strike, and you realize that something has to break. Some equilibrium has to shift because this level of tension cannot sustain itself indefinitely, and everyone knows that eventually, inevitably, Dumbledore and Grindelwald will have to face each other, and the entire magical world will hold its breath to see which vision of the future will prevail. You stand in the year 1945, and the Muggle world is reaching the end of World War II, and in a historical parallel that's either perfect timing or cosmic irony, the wizarding world is about to witness the culmination of its own great conflict, because Dumbledore has finally agreed to confront Grindelwald, and the entire magical community from Tokyo to Timbuktu is basically holding its collective breath like parents watching their children attempt something dangerous but necessary. The decision hasn't come easily, and you can see the decades of hesitation lifting from Dumbledore's shoulders even as new weights settle there, because choosing to face your former best friend, who you might also have been in love with, who you shared dreams and plans and one terrible tragedy with, is the kind of decision that rewrites a person's soul, assuming their soul hasn't already been rewritten several times by guilt and regret. The build-up to this confrontation is like nothing the wizarding world has seen before or since, and owls are flying frantically between continents carrying news and speculation, while wizarding newspapers are running special editions trying to capture the magnitude of what's about to happen. Sort of like if the World Cup and the apocalypse had a baby, and that baby could cast spells. You follow Dumbledore as he travels to Nurmengard, and the journey itself seems weighted with symbolism, because here's the man who chose teaching and protection approaching the fortress of the man who chose domination and control. And the contrast between their paths over the past decades couldn't be more stark if it was highlighted with neon ink and accompanied by a celestial choir singing about moral choices. Grindelwald knows Dumbledore is coming because he's a seer, but also because Dumbledore sent word ahead, which shows a level of courtesy that seems almost absurdly British, given that they're about to try to destroy each other, like scheduling a time for mutual attempted murder because anything else would be simply rude. The atmosphere around Nurmengard is electric with anticipation, and Grindelwald's followers have gathered, though you notice that many of them look uncertain now, because it's one thing to follow a charismatic leader when he seems invincible, and quite another to watch him face the one wizard everyone knows might actually be his equal or superior. You watch as Dumbledore walks through the fortress that Grindelwald built, past the inscription, "For the greater good," that must sting like pressing on a bruise, and you wonder what thoughts are running through his mind, whether he's remembering the idealistic boy who first spoke those words in summer sunshine, or whether he's focused entirely on the monster that boy became, though of course the answer is probably both, because human memory has this annoying habit of holding multiple truths simultaneously. The duel itself is legendary, and what records exist describe it as the greatest magical confrontation ever witnessed, with spells of such complexity and power that they rewrote several fundamental principles of magical theory, sort of like if Einstein and Newton had a physics debate that involved actual reality-bending effects and significantly more pyrotechnics. You watch as these two brilliant wizards who once dreamed together of changing the world now attempt to unmake each other with magic that transcends normal dueling, because this isn't just about disarming an opponent, but about the collision of two philosophies, two life paths, two versions of what the wizarding world should be. Grindelwald fights with the confidence of someone who has conquered most of Europe and who possesses the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand in existence, though you can't help but note that having a legendary weapon is less helpful if you're facing someone who's spent decades studying, teaching, and perfecting magic while drowning in guilt and determination. The quirky historical detail that often gets overlooked is that Dumbledore was wearing half-moon spectacles during this duel, which means the greatest dark wizard of the age was defeated by someone who looked like a kindly librarian, proving that fashion choices have no correlation with magical power, though it does make the visual considerably more entertaining. Their magic fills the air with lights and sounds that witnesses describe as both beautiful and terrifying, and you realize you're watching not just a duel, but a conversation conducted in spells, where every curse and counter-curse is also an argument about ideology, power, and the question of what actually constitutes the greater good. Dumbledore's advantage isn't just in raw power, but in something Grindelwald has lost over the years of violence and domination. The understanding that real strength comes from protecting rather than conquering, from building rather than destroying, from accepting your own flaws rather than trying to remake the entire world to hide them. The debate among magical historians continues about whether Dumbledore won because he was more powerful or because Grindelwald, on some level, couldn't bring himself to truly try to kill his old friend. And there's evidence for both interpretations, because the heart is complicated even in dark wizards, or perhaps especially in dark wizards who weren't born evil but chose it through a series of increasingly terrible decisions. You watch as the duel reaches its climax, and Dumbledore disarms Grindelwald, literally taking the Elder Wand from him, and in that moment you see something flicker across Grindelwald's face that might be relief or defeat or simply exhaustion, because maintaining an evil empire is probably quite tiring, even with the benefit of prophecy and a really impressive fortress. The defeat is total and immediate, and Grindelwald's followers scatter like startled birds. And suddenly, the movement that seemed so powerful and inevitable just moments ago collapses like a puppet with cut strings, proving that some regimes are held together entirely by the perception of their leader's invincibility and fall apart the moment that perception cracks. Dumbledore could kill Grindelwald, and many in the wizarding world expect him to, want him to, are practically writing the press releases about it already. But instead, he does something unexpected. He imprisons Grindelwald in the very fortress Grindelwald built, in Nurmengard. And you realize that this is a more profound punishment than death, because Grindelwald will spend the rest of his life contemplating what he built and what he lost, surrounded by his own propaganda about the greater good. This act of mercy, or perhaps revenge, or perhaps just the inability to kill someone he once loved, becomes one of the defining moments of Dumbledore's life. And scholars still argue about his motivations, whether it was compassion, cruelty, or simply the desire to avoid adding another death to his conscience. The wizarding world celebrates, and Dumbledore is hailed as a hero, showered with honors and awards, including becoming Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, though you notice that he never looks particularly happy about any of it, because victory over someone you once called friend is the kind of triumph that tastes like ashes, no matter how justified it was. The parallel timing with the end of World War II is striking, and historians note that 1945 marks the end of two dark periods simultaneously, one magical and one mundane. And while Grindelwald didn't cause the Muggle War, his visions of it and use of it as propaganda certainly intensified the magical conflict that ran alongside it. You stand in the aftermath, watching Dumbledore walk away from Nurmengard with the Elder Wand hidden away, carrying more guilt than glory, and you understand that this is a hero who knows exactly what heroism costs, who has paid in pieces of his soul for the safety of others, and who will carry the scars of this day for the rest of his exceptionally long life. The wizarding world begins the slow process of healing, of rebuilding communities torn apart by Grindelwald's ideology, and it will take decades for the wounds to fully close, if they ever do, because some divisions run too deep to simply disappear with the defeat of one dark wizard, no matter how comprehensive that defeat appeared to be. You follow the years after 1945, and Grindelwald sits in Nurmengard, imprisoned in his own fortress. And there's something particularly fitting about this arrangement, like a chef who cooked nothing but terrible meals being forced to eat exclusively from his own menu for the rest of his life. Except the meals are metaphorical and represent the consequences of decades of terrible choices. The top cell of the tallest tower becomes his permanent residence, and you watch as he ages there, surrounded by the stone walls he ordered constructed. Beneath the motto he chose to define his movement, and you wonder what thoughts occupy his mind during the long days and longer nights when he has nothing but time to reflect on everything that happened. The wizarding world moves on, as worlds do, and Grindelwald becomes a name parents use to frighten children into behaving, a cautionary tale about ambition and the corruption of power, though you notice that the details of his story get simplified in the retelling, losing the complexity of how a brilliant young man could genuinely believe he was doing good while causing so much harm. Dumbledore returns to Hogwarts and eventually becomes headmaster, and he never visits Grindelwald, never speaks of him, carries the Elder Wand in secret and with apparent reluctance. And you can see how the weight of that summer in 1899 and the duel in 1945 shapes every decision he makes for the rest of his life. The unusual detail that often surprises people is that Grindelwald apparently mellowed considerably in prison, spending his time reading and reflecting rather than plotting revenge or escape, which suggests that perhaps being defeated and imprisoned was actually what he needed to finally stop and consider whether the greater good he'd been pursuing was actually good at all. You travel forward through the decades, watching as new threats emerge in the wizarding world, and eventually a dark wizard named Tom Riddle, who will become Lord Voldemort, begins his own rise to power, and you can't help but notice the parallels and differences between these two dark wizards, because Voldemort is colder, more purely sadistic, lacking even Grindelwald's vision of a better world, however twisted that vision was. The 1970s arrive, and Voldemort's influence grows, and you learn that he becomes interested in the Elder Wand, the legendary object that Dumbledore took from Grindelwald decades earlier. And Voldemort's pursuit of power is so absolute that he will literally hunt down every scrap of legend and rumor if he thinks it will make him more powerful, like someone collecting Pokémon, but the Pokémon are instruments of death and suffering. In 1998, you watch as Voldemort himself travels to Nurmengard, seeking information about the Elder Wand from the imprisoned Grindelwald. And this scene is one of the most fascinating in the entire saga because here are two dark wizards, separated by generation and methodology, facing each other across a prison cell. Grindelwald, now an old man who has spent over 50 years in prison, faces Voldemort's questioning, and when the younger dark wizard demands to know where the Elder Wand is, Grindelwald lies, refusing to give up Dumbledore's secret even though he knows Voldemort will kill him for this refusal. You watch as Voldemort, in rage and frustration, murders the imprisoned Grindelwald, and there's something profound about this moment, because Grindelwald, who spent his freedom enslaving and murdering others, uses his imprisonment to protect the man who defeated him, suggesting that perhaps those decades of reflection actually changed him in ways that matter. Scholars debate whether this final act redeems Grindelwald in any way, with some arguing that refusing to betray Dumbledore after 50 years doesn't erase decades of atrocities, while others suggest that genuine growth and change should count for something even in someone who did terrible things. And honestly, both perspectives have merit because morality is complicated and people contain multitudes, even evil people who eventually try to be less evil. The historical parallel here is interesting because Grindelwald's story spans most of the 20th century, from his birth in 1883 through his death in 1998, meaning he witnessed both world wars, the Cold War, and the modern age, all from the perspective of someone who tried to prevent Muggle history by controlling it, and instead spent most of his life locked away while that history unfolded without his input. You consider the impact Grindelwald had on magical society, and it's substantial even decades after his defeat, because his movement raised fundamental questions about wizard-muggle relations that still haven't been fully resolved, about secrecy and integration, about power and responsibility, about whether the current system of magical hiding is sustainable or just, and these questions don't disappear just because the person who asked them in the worst possible way is defeated. The International Statute of Secrecy, which keeps the magical world hidden from Muggles, came under intense scrutiny during Grindelwald's reign, and while the statute survived, the debates he sparked about wizard-muggle relations continue in various forms, proving that sometimes even bad actors can identify real problems even if their solutions are nightmarish. You notice that Grindelwald's symbol, the triangular eye representing the Deathly Hallows, became so associated with dark magic that anyone bearing it after his defeat was viewed with immediate suspicion, sort of like how certain symbols in Muggle history became permanently tainted by their association with evil movements, though at least Grindelwald's symbol was original to him rather than stolen from ancient traditions. The relationship between Dumbledore and Grindelwald continues to fascinate magical historians, particularly after J.K. Rowling's revelation that Dumbledore's feelings were romantic, because it adds layers of tragedy to an already tragic story, making their duel not just a confrontation between good and evil, but between former lovers whose paths diverged catastrophically over questions of power and morality. You think about the greater good, that phrase Grindelwald carved above his prison entrance and used to justify countless atrocities, and how it represents one of the most dangerous ideas in existence. Because the moment someone decides they know what's good for everyone else and are willing to force that vision regardless of what others want, they've begun walking the same path Grindelwald walked, even if they'd be horrified by the comparison. The debate about consequentialism versus deontological ethics plays out dramatically in Grindelwald's story, because he justified present harm with promises of future good, believing the ends justified the means, while Dumbledore eventually learned that some means corrupt any ends they might achieve, that the path you take matters as much as the destination you claim to seek. You watch as the magical world continues to grapple with Grindelwald's legacy, and you realize that his story serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of charismatic leadership combined with absolute certainty, about the way good intentions can pave roads to terrible places, about how easy it is to convince yourself that your victims somehow deserve their suffering if you just frame your goals in sufficiently noble language. You examine the broader impact of Grindelwald's war on the global wizarding community, and the devastation extends far beyond Europe, because magical communities are interconnected in ways that Muggle societies aren't, with portkeys and apparition making distance nearly meaningless. So, a war that starts in Austria can touch lives in Australia or Argentina within days or even hours. The casualty counts are difficult to establish because magical populations are small and record-keeping during wartime is unreliable. But estimates suggest hundreds of wizards and witches died in direct confrontations, and thousands more muggles were killed in attacks or as collateral damage. And these numbers don't even account for the destroyed families, the orphaned children, the broken communities that will carry scars for generations. You travel through the war-torn magical districts of Europe, and you see buildings that once housed prosperous wizard families now lying in rubble, shops that specialized in particular types of magic closed forever because their owners fled or died, entire neighborhoods that will never recover their pre-war character because too many memories are soaked into the stones. The economic impact on magical Britain and Europe was substantial, and you watch as the wizard economy struggles to recover, with galleons flowing toward security and defense rather than innovation and culture. And it will take decades for magical arts and commerce to return to their pre-war flourishing. One quirky detail that often surprises people is that Grindelwald apparently had supporters in the American magical community as well, though the Magical Congress of the United States of America, MACUSA, managed to contain the movement more effectively than European ministries, partly because American wizards were already operating under stricter separation laws following the events of the 1920s that are detailed in other stories. You notice that certain magical families were torn apart by divided loyalties, with some members supporting Grindelwald's vision while others fought against him, and these divisions created feuds that lasted generations because apparently wizards are as capable as muggles of holding grudges for decades over ideological disagreements, proving that the ability to turn someone into a ferret doesn't automatically grant maturity or forgiveness. The role of neutral magical communities during the war is particularly interesting, with some countries like those in Scandinavia attempting to maintain neutrality while others were pulled into the conflict whether they wanted to be or not, and scholars debate whether magical neutrality was a defensible position or a moral failing, similar to debates about neutrality in Muggle conflicts. You watch as refugees from Grindelwald's territories flee to safer regions, and magical Britain becomes a haven for displaced wizards and witches, creating integration challenges that the Ministry of Magic handles with varying degrees of competence and compassion, which is to say, sometimes adequately, and sometimes with all the grace of a hippogriff in a china shop. The impact on magical education was profound, with several European magical schools forced to close temporarily or operate in reduced capacity, and you see students whose education was interrupted by war, creating a lost generation of partially trained wizards who will struggle to catch up for years. Because apparently even in the magical world, interrupted schooling has long-term consequences. Dumbledore's role as educator during this period becomes even more significant because Hogwarts remains open and operating throughout the war, providing stability and safety when much of the magical world is in chaos. And you realize that his choice to remain a teacher rather than seeking power was itself a form of resistance against everything Grindelwald represented. The historical parallel with World War II is impossible to ignore. And many scholars believe that Grindelwald actually saw the coming Muggle War in his visions and cynically used it as propaganda, showing his followers the horrors that would result if wizards didn't take control, conveniently failing to mention that his own actions would create a magical war equally devastating to magical communities. You follow the stories of individuals caught up in the conflict, like Newt Scamander, who worked against Grindelwald despite his personal preference for creatures over politics, proving that sometimes even the most apolitical people have to take stands when evil becomes too blatant to ignore. Though you imagine Newt would have much preferred to spend the entire period studying bowtruckles or interviewing dragons. The propaganda war was as important as the military one, and you watch as both sides publish newspapers, pamphlets, and magical broadcasts trying to sway public opinion, with Grindelwald's media machine being particularly sophisticated for its time, using combinations of truth, half-truth, and outright lies to paint his movement as inevitable and necessary, sort of like a magical version of authoritarian propaganda techniques that would become sadly familiar in the Muggle world. Some of his predictions were accurate, which made his other claims more credible even when they were complete fabrications, because mixing truth with lies is a classic technique of effective disinformation, proving that dark wizards understand marketing, psychology possibly better than they understand morality. You notice that women played significant roles on both sides of the conflict, and while magical society in this era was more egalitarian than Muggle society in some ways, it still had its prejudices and limitations, and the war both challenged and reinforced various gender dynamics in complicated ways that historians are still parsing out. The use of dark creatures in Grindelwald's forces is documented, with reports of him employing inferi, which are reanimated corpses, because apparently enslaving living humans wasn't enough, and he needed to extend his control to the dead as well, taking work-life balance to a disturbing new extreme that includes removing the life part entirely. The psychological impact on survivors is something that doesn't get discussed enough in historical accounts, and you watch as wizards and witches who fought in or lived through the war struggle with what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress, though the magical world's approach to mental health in the 1940s and 50s was about as sophisticated as their approach to anything else, meaning well-intentioned but often inadequate. The debate about whether the magical world could have prevented Grindelwald's rise continues, with some arguing that earlier intervention by the International Confederation of Wizards could have stopped him before he gained too much power, while others contend that his seer abilities and genuine charisma made him nearly impossible to counter until someone of Dumbledore's caliber confronted him directly. You consider how the war changed magical Britain specifically, pushing the ministry toward more aggressive defense policies and greater surveillance of potentially dangerous individuals, creating precedents that will later be invoked during Voldemort's rise, because societies rarely reverse security measures once implemented, even after the threat that justified them has passed. The memorial sites that were established after the war become places of pilgrimage for those who lost loved ones, and you stand at one such memorial, reading names carved in stone, each name representing a life cut short by Grindelwald's vision of the greater good. And you wonder if he ever visited these memorials during his long years in Normangard. If he ever truly counted the cost of his ambitions in terms of individual human lives, rather than abstract historical movements. You stand outside the fortress of Normangard in 1945, moments after the legendary duel has concluded and the air still crackles with residual magic, like the atmosphere after a lightning storm, but more so because this wasn't weather but the collision of two of the most powerful wizards ever to live, and the ambient magic they released will probably take years to fully dissipate from this location. The crowd that has gathered at a safe distance begins to realize that Dumbledore has won. And you watch as the news spreads like wildfire through the wizarding world, owls flying in every direction carrying the message that Grindelwald has been defeated, that the war is over, that the nightmare has ended. Though, of course, nightmares don't really end so much as they transform into different shapes and revisit you in unexpected moments. The way Dumbledore defeats Grindelwald is itself a subject of endless fascination, because unlike other famous duels in magical history that end with a single devastating spell, this confrontation was apparently a sustained display of magical theory and practice, with both wizards demonstrating abilities that most couldn't replicate in a lifetime of study, sort of like watching two chess grandmasters if chess pieces could explode and the board occasionally caught fire. You notice that Dumbledore takes possession of the Elder Wand but doesn't announce it publicly, instead letting people believe the legendary wand was lost or destroyed in the battle. And this secrecy will protect him for decades, because anyone seeking the Elder Wand won't know he has it, though eventually Voldemort will figure it out, proving that some secrets are too significant to stay buried forever. The unusual detail that magical historians find fascinating is that Grindelwald apparently didn't fight to kill Dumbledore, or at least didn't fight with the full ruthlessness he'd shown against other opponents. And there's debate about whether this was because some part of him still cared for his old friend, or because he saw in his prophetic visions that killing Dumbledore would ultimately lead to worse outcomes, or perhaps both, because human motivation is rarely simple, even in dark wizards. You watch as Dumbledore orders Grindelwald's imprisonment in Nurmengard rather than execution, and this decision is controversial, with many in the wizarding world calling for the Dark Wizard's death as justice for his victims. But Dumbledore holds firm, and you wonder whether this is mercy, revenge, an inability to kill someone he once loved, or simply the recognition that making himself executioner would complete some terrible transformation he's been trying to avoid since that day in Godric's Hollow. The process of dismantling Grindelwald's empire begins immediately, and you follow as Aurors and other magical law enforcement sweep through his territories, arresting his followers, breaking up his organizations, undoing his policies, and generally trying to cleanse Europe of his influence. Though you know from history that influence isn't so easily removed, especially when it tapped into genuine grievances and desires, however twisted the proposed solutions were. Some of his followers flee to remote locations, and a few will remain active for years, true believers who can't accept that their vision died with their leader's defeat. Sort of like magical holdouts who refuse to believe the war is over, except with more wands and less sense. The International Confederation of Wizards holds emergency sessions to address the aftermath, establishing commissions to investigate war crimes, to reunite families separated by the conflict, to rebuild damaged magical infrastructure, and you watch as the magical world attempts to process trauma on a massive scale without really having the psychological tools or frameworks to do so effectively. Dumbledore's rise to international prominence is immediate and somewhat unwelcome from his perspective, because he's offered positions of political power that he consistently refuses, accepting only educational and advisory roles, and this refusal to take power after defeating a Dark Lord actually enhances his moral authority in ways that accepting would have diminished. The quirky detail that often gets overlooked is that Dumbledore immediately returns to Hogwarts after the duel, not even staying for the celebrations, and when asked about his victory, he apparently said something characteristically enigmatic about how defeating someone you once called friend is no victory at all, which probably sounded very wise, but also slightly pretentious, because Dumbledore has never met a profound statement he didn't want to express in the most quotable way possible. You notice that the Elder Wand becomes a burden Dumbledore carries for the rest of his life, and he never uses it in casual magic, treats it with apparent wariness, as if constantly aware that this object has caused countless deaths throughout history as wizards murdered each other to claim its power. And now, he's added one more link to that chain by defeating Grindelwald, though at least he had the decency to do it through a duel rather than assassination. The historical parallel continues because 1945 also saw the end of World War II in the Muggle world, and you wonder about the overlap in timing, whether the end of Muggle fascism and magical fascism in the same year is pure coincidence, or whether the two conflicts influenced each other in ways that history hasn't fully documented, though given the statute of secrecy, any such influence would have been subtle and indirect. The rebuilding of magical Europe takes years, and you watch as new policies are implemented, new safeguards established against future would-be Dark Lords, and you can't help but notice that some of these safeguards involve exactly the kind of expanded government power and reduced individual freedom that often follows crises, because apparently both magical and Muggle societies respond to existential threats by giving their governments more authority, sometimes forgetting to take that authority back when the crisis passes. Grindelwald in his cell becomes a symbol and a warning, and Dumbledore ensures he's treated humanely despite his crimes, because even dark wizards deserve basic dignity. Though you imagine this policy didn't sit well with everyone who lost loved ones to Grindelwald's ambitions. The debate about punishment versus rehabilitation in magical justice gets renewed attention thanks to this case, with some arguing that Grindelwald should be subjected to harsh conditions as punishment, while others contend that the point of imprisonment should be protection of society and possible reformation of the criminal. And neither side fully wins this argument because moral questions rarely have simple answers. You stand at the moment of transition between the war years and the peace that follows, and you realize that this victory over Grindelwald will cast a long shadow over the rest of the century, shaping magical politics, influencing how future threats are perceived and addressed, and creating both a model for how to oppose dark wizards and a cautionary tale about the costs of waiting too long to act. You watch the decades pass after Grindelwald's imprisonment, and time moves differently in Nurmengard, where days blur into years and years blur into decades, and the man who once commanded armies and reshaped the political landscape of magical Europe now commands only the small space of his cell and whatever thoughts occupy his aging mind. The conditions of his imprisonment are neither luxurious nor deliberately harsh, and you see that he's provided with basic necessities, books, writing materials. Though whether he actually uses these things or simply sits in contemplation is information that doesn't leave the fortress, because Nurmengard keeps its secrets as thoroughly as its prisoner. The wizarding world largely forgets about Grindelwald as new concerns arise, as a new generation grows up knowing him only as a name from history books, a cautionary tale rather than a living threat, and you realize that this is perhaps the most fitting punishment for someone who sought to reshape history, to be relegated to a footnote in it, remembered less for his vision than for his defeat. You notice that Dumbledore never visits his former friend during all these years, and there's something profoundly sad about this. Two brilliant minds that once sparked off each other now spending decades on opposite ends of a gulf created by their choices, by one terrible day in Godric's Hollow and one necessary confrontation in 1945. And you wonder if they think of each other during these years, if memory softens or hardens with time. The unusual detail that emerges from later accounts is that Grindelwald apparently became something of a scholar during his imprisonment, studying magical theory without the pressure of trying to apply it to world domination, and guards reported that he sometimes spoke to himself in the complex, theoretical language of advanced magic, as if continuing lectures that no one was there to hear. You travel forward to 1998, and the wizarding world is in the grip of another dark wizard, and Lord Voldemort is, in many ways, worse than Grindelwald, colder, more sadistic, lacking even the pretense of idealism that characterized Grindelwald's movement. And you see that Voldemort is hunting for the Elder Wand, seeking to add its power to his already considerable abilities, because apparently being one of the most powerful dark wizards in history isn't enough if there's a possibility of being slightly more powerful. The journey to Nurmengard must feel strange for Voldemort, and you watch as this dark wizard who has spent years killing anyone in his path approaches the cell of the dark wizard who preceded him, and there's something almost ceremonial about this meeting, like a torch being passed. Except, though the torch is evil, and no one actually wants it. Grindelwald, now in his hundreds, faces Voldemort with a calmness that comes from having nothing left to lose. Because what can Voldemort threaten him with? That's worse than 50+ years of imprisonment. And you see that this old dark wizard is not afraid, which seems to infuriate Voldemort because fear is his primary currency, and here's someone refusing to trade in it. The interrogation is brief, and Voldemort demands to know the location of the Elder Wand. And you watch as Grindelwald, in his final moments, makes a choice that redeems nothing, but perhaps indicates something. Tells Voldemort he doesn't know or lies about its location, protecting the secret of Dumbledore's possession of the wand, and this small act of defiance costs him his life. Voldemort kills Grindelwald without hesitation, and you realize that this is how the story of one of history's most dangerous dark wizards ends, not in a blaze of glory or dramatic final stand, but in a cold cell, murdered by someone worse than himself. And there's something almost pitiful about it, except that pity requires forgetting the hundreds who died because of Grindelwald's ambitions, and that's not a forgetting you can manage. The debate among scholars about this final moment is intense, with some arguing that Grindelwald's lie shows genuine reformation, and perhaps even love for Dumbledore persisting across decades of separation, while others contend that it was simply a final act of defiance against someone trying to follow in his footsteps. And honestly, both interpretations have evidence supporting them, because human motivation is complicated, even in final moments. You consider what Grindelwald might have been thinking during those last decades, whether he regretted his choices, whether he convinced himself he was right all along, whether he found peace or spent every moment tormented by the weight of what he'd done, and you realize that we'll never know because whatever transformation or lack thereof occurred in that cell died with him. The historical record shows that news of Grindelwald's death barely registered in the wider wizarding world, which was consumed with the ongoing crisis of Voldemort's second rise to power, and you see that Grindelwald, who once commanded headlines and inspired both devotion and terror, dies essentially unmourned except perhaps by Dumbledore, who learns of it and whose reaction is not recorded but, you imagine, must be complex, a mixture of relief, grief, guilt, and a dozen other emotions that come from losing someone who was once your entire world even though they became a monster. The quirky detail that often surprises people is that Grindelwald's personal effects, what few he had in his cell, were apparently destroyed after his death rather than archived or studied, as if the wizarding world wanted to erase even these small traces of him, though of course you can't really erase someone from history just by burning their possessions. The memories and consequences remain. You watch as Nurmengard itself falls into disuse after Grindelwald's death, and the prison that he built becomes another ruin in the Austrian Alps, though the inscription "For the Greater Good" remains carved above its entrance, a permanent reminder of how noble-sounding words can be twisted to justify terrible acts, and tourists in later years will visit it the way people visit sites of historical atrocities, trying to understand how such things could happen, usually failing because understanding evil is harder than recognizing it. The relationship between Dumbledore and Grindelwald, even after death, continues to fascinate, and J.K. Rowling's revelation about Dumbledore's sexuality adds depth to an already complex dynamic, because now you understand that Dumbledore spent decades carrying not just the guilt of possibly killing his sister and of being complicit in Grindelwald's early ideology, but also the pain of loving someone who became everything he opposed. And that's the kind of emotional burden that would crush most people, but that Dumbledore apparently carried while simultaneously becoming the greatest wizard of his age and a beacon of hope for everyone fighting against dark magic. You realize that Grindelwald's story is ultimately about choices and consequences, about how brilliant people can convince themselves that terrible actions serve noble purposes, about how charisma and intelligence without wisdom and compassion can create monsters, and about how some mistakes are so fundamental that they reshape the course of a life, or many lives, or an entire civilization, and no amount of time or regret can fully undo them. You stand now at the end of this long tale, and the shadows are lengthening around you like dark water rising, and you consider the full arc of Grindelwald's life, from brilliant student to dark lord to defeated prisoner to forgotten corpse, and you realize that this is a story without simple lessons, because human nature is complicated, and history is messier than the neat narratives we try to impose on it after the fact. The legacy Grindelwald leaves behind is written in scars on individuals and institutions, in policies implemented to prevent future Grindelwald's, in the memories of those who survived his war, and in the absence of those who didn't. And you understand that evil has consequences that ripple outward like stones thrown in water, touching shores far from the original impact, affecting people who never even knew the source of their pain. You think about Dumbledore, who defeated Grindelwald but never truly escaped him, who carried the weight of their friendship and its terrible ending through more than a century of life, who became arguably the greatest wizard of all time, partly because he learned from his mistakes. In a way, Grindelwald never did, and you wonder whether Dumbledore ever found peace or whether some burdens are too heavy to ever fully set down. The question of whether Grindelwald could have been stopped earlier haunts the historical record, and you consider all the moments when intervention might have changed the trajectory, when someone might have challenged his ideology before it hardened into movement. And you realize that this is the terrible game of historical what-ifs that never provides answers, because we only know what actually happened, not what might have been. The broader question about wizard-muggle relations that Grindelwald raised, however badly, remains unresolved, and you see that the international statute of secrecy is still in effect. Wizards still hide from muggles, and the fundamental issues he exploited about fear and power and the burden of hiding one's true nature continue to simmer beneath the surface of magical society, waiting for the next demagogue to exploit them or the next visionary to address them more constructively. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. You notice how the story of Grindelwald and Dumbledore reflects broader themes about love and power, about how the greatest potential for evil often exists in those with the greatest potential for good, about how fine the line is between visionary and tyrant, between confidence and arrogance, between changing the world and destroying it. The debate about the nature of the greater good continues in philosophy and magical ethics, and you realize that Grindelwald's appropriation of this phrase poisoned it in some ways, making people suspicious of anyone who claims to act for collective benefit. Though, of course, that suspicion is itself valuable because the greatest atrocities in history have often been committed by people absolutely certain they were serving a greater purpose. You watch as evening falls over the landscape of this story, and the details begin to soften and blur like a painting left too long in the rain, and you feel yourself drifting as the weight of all these years and all these choices settles over you like a blanket, heavy but somehow comforting in its completeness. The wind picks up, carrying with it the scent of rain and time, and you realize that stories like this one serve as memories for civilizations, as ways of processing trauma and learning, however imperfectly, from the past, and you wonder whether future generations will face their own Grindelwalds, their own dark wizards who dress evil in the language of good and make destruction sound like progress. Your eyes grow heavy as you contemplate the circular nature of history, how each generation thinks their struggles are unique until they study the past and realize that human nature, whether magical or muggle, repeats certain patterns with depressing regularity, though each repetition carries its own unique details and its own specific sorrows. The stars are appearing now overhead, and you watch them emerge like memories surfacing, each one a point of light in the darkness, and you think about how even in the darkest times, people like Dumbledore eventually stand up to oppose people like Grindelwald. And while the cost is always high and the victory never perfect, somehow the light persists. Somehow goodness continues even when it seems impossibly difficult. You feel yourself sinking deeper into reflection as the night deepens around you, and the story of Grindelwald becomes just one thread in the vast tapestry of magical history, important but not all-consuming, a cautionary tale that teaches, by negative example, showing what not to do, what not to become, what not to believe when someone promises you power without cost or progress without sacrifice. The weight of the tale presses gently on your consciousness, and you find your thoughts drifting like leaves on a slow stream, touching briefly on Grindelwald's brilliance and his terrible waste of it, on Dumbledore's burden and his grace in carrying it, on all the unnamed victims whose stories we'll never know, but whose absence shapes the world they left behind. The night is deep and quiet now, and you rest in the knowledge that this story, however dark, is finished, that Grindelwald is gone, that his vision died with him, though the questions he raised and the wounds he inflicted remain for others to address and heal, and you close your eyes and let the story settle into memory. Another chapter in history, another lesson learned too late and at too high a cost. Another reminder that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, magical or not. And the only way to stay on the right side is constant vigilance, constant questioning of one's own certainty, constant humility before the complexity of choosing rightly in a complicated world. And with these thoughts, you drift away into sleep, where perhaps you dream of a world where brilliant young men use their gifts for building rather than destroying, where the greater good means actually serving others rather than dominating them, where power and wisdom walk hand in hand instead of forever pulling in opposite directions, and the last thing you hear before sleep claims you completely is the wind sighing through the ruins of Nurmengard, where the inscription still reads, "For the greater good," a permanent scar on the landscape, and a permanent warning carved in stone, fading now as you fade, becoming memory as all things eventually do, drifting into the quiet dark where stories rest after they've been told, where history waits to teach those willing to learn, where you finally let go and sleep deeply and completely, the tale concluded. The lesson offered if not learned, the darkness acknowledged and somehow impossibly transcended.